Can everybody hear me? I think, okay. I won't say testing. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to first, ask everyone to give a big round of applause to our guest today. Thank you. It is wonderful to have Dr. Shashi Tharoor here with us on our campus in Hyderabad. These are uncertain times, so we're really thankful that you made the journey, like I said, in these uncertain COVID times. And it's wonderful to have you. As the cliche goes, he doesn't really need an introduction. We all know that he is a three-time member of parliament. He has been, of course, a very successful politician, but before that, he was a very successful diplomat. He's been a union minister. He is an acclaimed author, both fiction, non-fiction. What is it, 23 books now? 23 books now. And in fact, the latest book is in my hand.
23rd is in your hand.
The 23rd is in my hand. It's a really big one, but we'll come to that later. So Shashi Tharoor is somebody we know who is, hugely accomplished. His life journey is very inspiring, and that is why he is our change maker this month. You will have an opportunity over the next hour to ask him any question that you like, whether it's on current affairs or his own journey. But I'm going to begin that conversation. Shashi Tharoor, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Nidhi. Good to be with you and good to be on this lovely campus.
Your 23rd book is actually here, right here in my hand. Where do you find the time and the space and the mind space to do this much writing? I have to ask.
Well, you only have to find time if you've lost it in the first place, right? So I try not to lose a minute as far as I can possibly help it. And obviously it comes at the expense of other things. It sometimes comes at the expense of friends, of entertainment. I don't watch as many movies as I might otherwise like to. I don't see much of my favorite sport, cricket, as much as I'd like to, and so on. So writing is so important to me that I do it whenever I can. And what happens often is that it means writing at night. I was never a particular night bird. In my student days, I was an early morning person. But as I got into the situation where my profession occupies my day, including my mornings, I realized the only time that I could really have to myself was after the visitors and phone calls had all disappeared and the social obligations. And that often meant 11 o'clock at night.
In fact, I read somewhere that you published your first short story at the age of 10, was it?
Yeah.
So that's a pretty early start for a writer. How did that happen?
Well, I was an asthmatic child. I used to suffer quite terribly as a small kid. And what happened was that I was very often confined to bed, unable to breathe. Those were the days before inhalers and other fancy gadgets. You basically, all the doctors had to offer was a pill which made your heart go thud, 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 and you stayed awake struggling to breathe. I mean, that was essentially the experience of asthmatics in those days. What do you do? You really can't sleep or rest or anything. There's no television in India in those days. There was no, obviously, computers and mobile phones and laptops were not even a gleam in an inventor's eye. And so books were my only escape. And I would find in books escape, education, and entertainment. So I became a voracious and rather precocious reader. As the eldest child, I rapidly ran out of the books that I had or that I could borrow from the library. And so I would have to read my parents' books because there was nobody else above me, no elder brother or sister. And so the result was that I started reading way ahead of my age group. But even that, at some point the attractions of your parents' books begin to pall.
I mean, don't
and
tell
then
me
what
you
do you
read.
do? So I discovered two things to do that also had to do with books. One was to invent or play a game called book cricket, which consisted of making up imaginary teams and opening the pages of a fat book. And the last digit of the page number would give you the run scored off that particular delivery. And so you'd make up a cricket match. And the other thing I did was write. And I wrote stories very much like the stories I enjoyed reading. So, I was reading the Enid Blyton stories, the Five Fine Doubters and Dog and so on.
And War and
So I
Peace.
invented the Six Solvers, who were going off to an Indian village, very much like her British villages, and solving mysteries very much like, a very derivative. As a young boy, I would read stories of this World War one and later two fighter race called Biggles. And so I started writing stories about an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Bellows, and so that sort of thing. And in many ways, it was a way actually of keeping myself occupied. But I was blessed with a father who took my writing seriously enough to get his secretary to type it up, and I could have a manuscript I could show around, I mean, a typescript that I could show to friends.
In fact, he was such a big influence on you, wasn't he? In
was.
terms of the fascination that you developed with words. You've written about how he played word games with you.
That's right.
And what was that like? And he himself was a very good writer, wasn't he?
He was, but he never wrote professionally, at least not very much. He was on the management side of the Statesman for 25 years. So all I can testify to the quality of his writing is his correspondence. He wrote lovely letters. But in terms of the kind of word games and so on, and the fascination with words that he instilled in me, that was him at every day. He loved word games. He was a Scrabble nut. When he moved back from England to India in the 50s, it wasn't widely played in India, but he managed to create a little circle around him in Bombay that used to get together on weekends to play Scrabble, that sort of thing. And he invented wonderful word games. Like when my sisters and I were growing up, he would set us little puzzles with words. So, take a 10-letter word or an 8-letter word, and then make smaller words out of it, and see how many words you could come up with. That was something that we played a lot. In cars, he invented an absolutely fun game where one person would imagine a 5-letter word, and the others would have to guess that word by guessing other 5-letter words, and all the person who has imagined the word would say is how many letters matched. And you think that's impossible to do, but in fact, within 20 guesses, most people can get most words. And as we got good at it, he started thinking of tougher and tougher words. So we had lots of fun like that. But the thing about Dad and words was, he enjoyed words as words, and he imparted that love of words to us. But at the same time, I think he always had a sense that words mattered, not just as words, but as they mattered as vehicles for wanting to convey something of value to others. I think we're having some. Can you hear us all at the back properly? No problem.
Yeah, they can.
Yeah. So that the words and their employment, their use, became something very central to who I was, but also a source of endless delight and fascination. So I liked reading a lot, and reading indiscriminately helped, because my father never stopped me from reading anything that I wanted to read, whether it was junk or whether it was clearly above my level, because his assumption was.
The mystery is solved.
Whether it was junk or whether it was clearly above my level. So what I did essentially was that I ended up reading a lot of stuff, but I think his attitude was right, and I followed it with my own kids, which is that, if you stop them from reading junk, how will they know what junk is? Let them see the difference between junk writing and good writing.
What is the junk, may I ask, that you ever read while growing up?
Oh, I read some pulp fiction and some thrillers, and there were good, bad ones. I mean, I would say Harold Robbins probably wrote some good, bad ones, and some bad ones. I read those. An uncle was once horrified to find me at age 12 or 13 with a soft porn novel called by an American author called Ted Mark, and he was extremely disappointed. He said, "Do you know what your son is reading?" and so on. My father said, "Let him. He'll outgrow these things. If I tell them not to read, then it actually acquires more appeal." And so I read it, and at the end of the day, and my father did say, people are concerned. This is not the kind of thing you should be polluting your mind with. So you can read one or two to find out what it's all about, but don't make it a habit. And I took him very seriously.
So, just coming back to your childhood and we're trying to get to know you personally a bit better. You were born in England, but you moved to India soon after that. So, if I may ask, where does the accent come from?
This is the English we were actually taught.
Where?
The thing, in school. In fact, I went to school in Bombay and subsequently in Calcutta, and most of the teachers spoke this kind of English. And certainly at Campion School, Bombay, I can tell you that this was the English that the teachers spoke. Now, I'm not sure what it is that I'm doing.
1 second. We're going to help you with that and resolve this once and for all. 1 second.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure that works. That'll be too low. I'll hold it. It's fine. But then you may have to put up with the occasional hiccup like that. So anyway, so I was saying that we moved to India when I was very young. But in those days, I'm afraid, I'm not sure saying that I approve of this, but I'm afraid this was very much an attempt to make little, English-speaking boys out of us Indians. And so the schools had teachers. In fact, pretty much all my English teachers in school at Campion were themselves either Anglo-Indian or 1 or 2 cases were even foreign at Campion School, Bombay, in the early 60s. And so this was the kind of English that we were taught to imitate. Now, I happen to have a decent ear. That is, if you have a good ear, you're able to replicate the sounds you hear. And perhaps it helped that over my childhood, my family moved London to Bombay, Bombay to Calcutta, and then I moved from Calcutta to Delhi to go to college. So in no place was one particular language, one particular Indian language, in a position to crowd out my English. You'll find that those whose English accents are, shall we say, a bit different, it's because they are much more naturally at home with the mother tongue at home, and therefore that mother tongue's inflections invade their English. Now, having gone to schools like this, I then ended up in St. Stephen's, where in any case large numbers of people spoke like this also. So you've met a lot of Stephanians, so you know what I mean. And that's how it was. And then once you've acquired a certain way of speaking, and I did a fair amount of public speaking debates and contests. We even had elocution contests in Bombay.
I can see you doing that.
So growing up doing all of that, I was determined not to let the way I spoke be influenced by something like going off to America. So when I went to graduate school...
I was going to ask you, because you worked in the UN for years. You didn't pick up the twang.
No American accent. I thought, since I already have the English language, why do I suddenly need to change it into something it wasn't meant to be? So when I was there in graduate school, in fact, I still remember the serving lady at the cafeteria saying that I shouldn't ask for tomato because it sounded affected. I really should say tomato. I thought, I know it's a tomato, it's not a tomato. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I would love to hear your American accent, but that's on another note. What was your childhood like when you look back on it, growing up with 2 sisters? Was it a childhood of privilege, you would say? Was it a childhood of struggle? How was it?
No, it was a fairly typical middle-class Indian childhood, in the sense that family believed in all the traditional values of hard work. I had the additional handicap of asthma, which is a character-building illness, because when you're struggling for something as basic as being able to breathe, everything requires that much more of an effort, and so you acquire habits of making the effort and of self-discipline, which stood me in good stead even when the asthma became much more modest and much more manageable over the years. But I can tell you that certainly as a kid, going to school or writing examinations, when even something as basic as being able to breathe wasn't something you could take for granted, that really did a lot to stiffen my resolve. And perhaps it gave me, for example, some of the gifts of concentration that are so important in our attention deficit era. I think you really need to be able, when you listen to a lecture in class, to be able to absorb it and not allow yourself to be distracted, that sort of thing. So that certainly helped. So the thing was, we would come back home, do our homework, and then be allowed to do whatever we wanted to do. I wanted to play, especially I wanted to play cricket, but I just was so often ill that I was often confined either to bed or at least to the room. And so again, that writing then developed. And of course, the fact that my early scribblings were published had given me a certain encouragement. There's nothing more addictive, I think, than seeing your name in print for the first time. It's rather like the first bite of chocolate or the first kiss or whatever one is allowed to say on campus. You want to keep doing it again and again, and the result was that I ended up keeping on writing. And what was again good about the writing was it was for Indian magazines, read by the kind of people we were living amongst and were growing up with. So I was appearing in publications like the Illustrated Weekly or Eve's Weekly, or later when it was established, Junior Statesman, then JS, Youth Times, publications like that. And so the thing was that it was people you knew, people you went to school with who were reading you were getting feedback from your peers. To this day, I come across people of my vintage who remember me principally by having read me when I was 10, 12, 13 years old. That's very gratifying. You know, it really was very satisfying. So I would do that. And then the extracurriculars that I could do, I did. So I did a lot of school debating and speech contests and quiz contests and that sort of stuff. And that again held me in good stead for what I became later.
Were you a good student?
Yeah.
In that traditional sense of good grades?
Well, I was a good student, perhaps because of these qualities that my overcoming illness helped with. But also, I think, possibly because I was somebody who was just very good at taking exams. So I kept coming first at everything without necessarily knowing what I was writing in the examination. This is one of those things which I remember when at the end of class 8 we had to stream between science and humanities, and I chose humanities. There was shock and horror at the school, and the parents and the principal called in my parents and said, "This is our best science student. He's come first in science throughout the time he's been in the school from class 3. Why does he want to do humanities?" And my parents, who like all middle-class Indian parents wanted their children to be engineer or a doctor or whatever, they said, "Why on earth are you doing this?" They saw their sort of hopes being dashed at the altar of my obstinacy. And I said, "Because I can't stand science." And they said, "But you've come first in science throughout." And I said, "Listen, I just know how to study for examinations. But the day after I've written that exam, I will have forgotten everything I wrote on the paper. Whereas you ask me about history or literature, going beyond the syllabus or anything taught in the school, and I can speak with some authority and without looking at any notes, because I read these subjects out of my own interest." In fact, years later, I remember an uncle of mine suddenly producing a notebook of mine he'd kept from my class 10, which was a notebook of essays on Indian history that I'd written for my own pleasure, that had nothing to do with the homework at school. They were not corrected by a teacher, they were just my writing. So that level of interest that I had is what, and I must say I was blessed with parents for that generation who were liberal enough to say, "All right, do what you want to do, follow your bliss." And it struck me how lucky I was, because even for the next generation, that people of my time who've had children now, because whenever I go abroad, and particularly when I was in government, but even when I'm in the opposition, our young foreign service people are often deputed to look after me, and I make it a point to ask them, "So, you know, what did you study? What's your background?" And I was horrified by the large number of young doctors and even some young engineers who were telling me that they were there. And I said, "So why did you do that?" I mean, I said, very frankly, I said to 2 or 3 of them, "You've wasted a medical place that is so difficult in our country to get." And they would all say, "Sorry, sir, we really wanted to be in the civil services, but we had to do this for our parents. They wanted us. We were good enough at the subject, so we had to do the exams and become doctors or engineers. But the moment that we had done that, we took the UPSC exams, and I'm very happy to be in the Foreign Service." And the problem is that this is because even in my generation, parents still want their children to fulfill their unrealized ambitions.
Yeah.
And I honestly think that's wrong. I don't know of any parents around here, but I would urge you never to do that to your children, because at the end of the day, we will move on, our generation, and the next lot are the ones who are going to have to go to work to fulfill the challenges and responsibilities of a job that they actually dislike doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not particularly good for the nation either, or for the individuals.
I'm going to give you a better mic, if that's okay. That will make it easier for you as well.
Thank you. Well, this is not a better mic.
No, it will be. It will be.
Is this any better? Yeah, okay, slightly it's come to life.
It's interesting you mentioned the Foreign Service, because I believe you were interested. I mean, obviously, I'm not surprised that you were interested in joining the IFS. But I read somewhere that this was the emergency had been imposed.
That's right.
And you took a moral stand at that time that I will not sit for this exam with this happening in the country. You took that stand. And that's a pretty brave thing to do at that age.
You know, Yeah, but it was, I suppose, a brave thing to do. But I had really seen a lot. See, I had gone off to the States in '75 to go to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and do my graduate degrees, and eventually, as it turned out, my PhD, though I hadn't intended to stay on that long. And when I went, the emergency was still fresh. I'd just come from India. In fact, in a minor way, I'd been a victim of the emergency because a short story of mine called The Political Murder had been picked for publication by JS. And as soon as the emergency was declared, and before I left the country, I saw it, in fact, in the JS office. They had parked censors in all the newspaper offices in the first few months of the emergency, and the censors really lacked all imagination. They had stamped this one as banned for publication. And I was shown the thing, you know, the article, the story. So in some ways, I should have felt particularly aggrieved. But when I got to America for the first time, and I think this is a fairly common feeling for many Indians, perhaps even today, you almost feel instinctively the need to defend and explain your country. And I was no exception. Having got to America and seeing all the ignorance about India in the Americans around me, and some of the frankly biased or even hostile questioning, I became a sort of fervent, unpaid ambassador for India at age 19, sort of talking about the country. And on the emergency, I basically said, look, it's precisely people like me, the ones who can afford to write articles in newspapers and so on, who may have reasons to complain. But for the nation, for the poor, for the bonded laborers, for this and that, it's going to do wonders and so on. So I ended up actually internalizing the government's arguments for the emergency. But Fletcher was a mid-career place. I was one of the very few who'd come straight out of university. And my roommate was a journalist who had actually worked full-time for 2 years and was continuing to work to pay his way through graduate school. So he would go off to his radio station, which is where he worked at the time, and come back. In those days, you know, you had telex stories?
Yes.
So he would come back with literally reams of stories from India, which is far more than the American media would have space to publish. There wasn't that much interest in India, after all. So, you know, this would be what you could actually see in the New York Times or whatever in the library, all the newspapers in the library, wouldn't even be 5% of the stuff he was bringing back. And those things were really eye-opening. So reading all the things that were going wrong in India during the emergency sobered me up very quickly from having drunk the Kool-Aid earlier. And the other thing was a couple of episodes within America itself. There was a student leader, fairly straightforward name, something like Arvind Kumar or Arun Kumar or something in Chicago, who had been very outspoken critic of the emergency. And when his passport needed renewal, he went to renew it, the embassy refused to renew his passport. And I thought, my God, this passport is what has been given to us by our freedom struggle against the British. This is the embodiment of our pride. It's our entitlement. If they can do this, you know, how can I possibly defend such a system? And so that whole process of watching the emergency from abroad really intensified my sort of moral clarity, if you like, about what was wrong about the suspension of democracy. I was very glad when the emergency was indeed lifted. I was pleased that the results went the way they did, and that a peaceful transition occurred. And all of that was something that made me very proud. But, and so, you know, I could have taken the exams at that point, but I just felt that, and I'm sure my good friend Akbaruddin will forgive me for saying this, I felt at that point that government service was a service that could oblige you to do things. I remember there was a very senior foreign service, ICS man, in fact, Kewal Singh was the ambassador in Washington, and he had spent the 22 months of the emergency saying the most unctuous things in favor of the Prime Minister, the government, the system, and so on. And the day the election results were declared, the same man turned 360 degrees and started attacking everything that Mrs. Gandhi had said or done, and the government and so on, and hailed the victory of the democratic forces. And I thought, you know, if a man with that much of accomplishment and credit in his life could be reduced to this by government service, I want no part of it. So I actually turned it down Not because I had a UN offer or anything, which I didn't at that point, but because I genuinely felt that I, knowing who I was as a human being, would find it uncomfortable to have to mortgage my own convictions to that degree. Now, all of that was an overreaction, and I can say it very, very truthfully that I've seen, for example, how many of our officers have done very well in dealing with and serving governments with which they were profoundly in disagreement, but always keeping the distinction between serving the country and serving the party in power in mind. And they did it very well, particularly friends in the Foreign Service. And I must say that, that looking at that, I realized that with a little more maturity, I might have done differently. But anyway, my life has been what it's been.
It's interesting that, many decades later, you ended up becoming a politician and you joined the Congress party, of which you're a member of parliament. Do you feel, given your very strong stand on the emergency that time, that the party has repaired or made up for what happened back then?
Oh yeah, the Congress party that I joined was very different from the Congress party of the emergency, in my view. And what was amusing was that when there were rumors in the media that I was being considered for a ticket, you can imagine that various aspirants for the same ticket started sending pages from my writings, because my paper trail is as long as your arm, and so there's plenty of evidence for my heretical beliefs. So pages and pages were sent to Mrs. Gandhi. In fact, one of my meetings with a big amused smile, she showed me sheafs of pages of photocopies from my books that were critical of the Congress party. And during the elections, I don't know how it is in other states, because I've only ever fought these elections in Kerala, but we have these open-air public meetings, a tradition of that. Thank you. There's a tradition of open-air public meetings in Kerala, where the candidates stand in a kind of debating format, and the public actually asks them questions and comments. And during my first election in 2009, the communists, I was contesting a seat where the two previous elections had been won by the communists. So the communists would make sure there was somebody in the front row, often the same guy, a well-known lawyer, with copies of the Malayalam editions of my books, whose job was to read out some of my critical comments about the emergency and the Congress party and so on, and say, now how can you expect us to take you serious as a Congress candidate? To which my answer was very simple. I'm standing by every word I wrote about those events, but I'm not fighting the elections of 1977, I'm fighting the elections of 2009. And this is a very different Congress party from the one I critiqued at that time. It is, in fact, in many ways, an embodiment of the values of pluralism, diversity, democracy that I want to fight for in India.
All right, I'll let you take a sip of tea and open this up to the audience and to our students and faculty members here. If you have a question for Shashi Tharoor, please raise your hand. Okay, the gentleman in the orange shirt, this way please, on my right. Yeah, thank you. We'll get the mic to you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Pleasure to see you. My name is Audumpar and I'm from Kautilya School of Public Policy. My question is about the growing trend in Indian politics of political opportunism. We see that
I'm sorry, I don't think I heard that.
Political opportunism, many politicians, they leave their party. So
that's right.
Yeah. So what do you make of the losing political commitments towards the ideology?
You know, it's a very good question. In fact, I have an essay on this theme in this very book that Nidhi held up a few minutes ago. I find that extremely difficult to swallow. But I want to qualify that in a brief way. I believe that a political party is simultaneously two things. It is an embodiment of certain ideas, values, principles, and policies that its members are expected to be largely in agreement with. I mean, you wouldn't want to be an arch-capitalist and be a member of the Communist Party, though there are a few examples of that in Kerala. But you have to have a certain, for lack of a better word, a certain ideological commitment to a set of beliefs within a party. Otherwise, why are you in that party? But the second thing is that party is also a vehicle, an organizational vehicle to fulfill those particular values and principles and policies. It may be that you may have your own convictions on values and policies, but you find that the party you've become part of is not able to deliver effectively results that would help those policies to be promoted. It seems to me that if you leave the party then, it would be all right, provided you either get out of politics or go to another party with the same set of values. But if you were to go, as some of my Congress party colleagues have sadly done in the last couple of years, to a party that you have been attacking for most of your political life, which holds to a diametrically opposed set of values from what you've been defending, that is what I would agree with you is pure opportunism. And that, to my mind, is very, very difficult to accept. Because if politics is not about beliefs and principles, what is it? The purpose of politics in a democracy is to have honest disagreement about the best ways to create a better society. That's essentially politics in a nutshell. I don't know if you may all have better definitions from your political science classes. I fortunately never studied political science, so I can tell you that I'm just speaking as a human being who watches all this and has watched it around the world for quite some time. Politics is about saying, you know, if I come to power, I will do this and make your lives better. That's my job. And somebody else says, no, but the way we will do it will be better. Now, of course, you can organize yourself by interest, by class, by religion, by caste, God knows what else in our country. That's a different issue. But the ideas should be relatively consistent. So, to my mind, there is frankly no common ground in terms of basic ideological conviction when it comes to our society and the nature of our nation, including our constitutional identity. There's no common ground between the Congress on the one hand and the BJP on the other. In economics, there could well be overlaps. I don't think that it's a sheer, straightforward cleavage. Some of us saw one initially when the BJP was the party of India shining and the business, government has no business to be in business, and all of those slogans we heard for some time. And we wanted to be the party of the Aam Aadmi and help the poor and so on. But now that distinction is blurring because the BJP has also borrowed wholesale some of the earlier policies of the Congress or the UPA. And I think that's probably good that there is a broad area of consensus on economics. But when it comes to what is India, are we a nation, for example, that is intended to be a Hindu Rashtra? Are we not? On these things, there is simply no common ground. And it seems to be very difficult that you've spent all your political life advocating one set of beliefs, and suddenly the next day, and I don't mean only Congress to BJP, there have also been cases of BJP to Congress. And I find that equally inexplicable.
Ooh.
Plenty of cases. The most famous, of course, is Shankar Singh Waghela in Gujarat.
Oh, I meant recently.
No, recently there were two cases, including one in a by-election taking place this week. I won't go into the details, where the Congress eventually disowned this candidate.
Yes, I saw that.
Because he was continuing to spout BJP kind of language, and the Congress party was in full revolt about it. So the fact is that we do have, I think, to care about what people believe.
All right. This young lady in the middle. Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. In the blue kurta. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's because your hair is long.
It's fine. Okay.
And she was really trying to achieve gender balance.
It's fine. People often blame, right-wing politics for to be the root cause for the oppression of religious minority.
I'm really having difficulty following you. Sorry.
Okay.
You want to take
Can
your
you hold the
mask
mic a
off?
little
Yeah,
closer, maybe?
No, just take the mask. Yeah.
Okay. People often blame, right-wing politics to be the root cause for the oppression of religious minorities, and for the most part, they are to blame. But do you think a mere, change in administration is enough to, eradicate or, at least minimize this seemingly complex issue?
No, I think your question is not only right, but it's particularly topical, because what has changed, very frankly, in the last 10, 15 tops, maybe 10 years of Indian politics, is the insidious role of social media in indoctrinating the way people think and what they believe they know. That wasn't there in the past. In the past, if you change a government, the government that sets the agenda for the nation can also set the discourse for the nation. So if you have a government that really makes a virtue of pluralism, shouts it from the rooftops, has tax incentives for movies that celebrate pluralism, has programs for minorities, talks about them, ostentatiously depicts itself, in those circumstances, the public mind is also influenced that way. But today, what has changed is that the dominant political currents of the day, or current of the day, has been able to infect the minds of people beyond the process of merely acquiring power and retaining it administratively. It is, in fact, quite dramatic to realize how many people now get the bulk of their information from their mobile phone, often on WhatsApp or on some other such mechanism, which is free of fact-checking, which is very often fact-free. I mean, it's literally this joke about, he got his education at WhatsApp University is not just a joke. I mean, every one of us has an uncle somewhere or more who spout things as received wisdom, which are actually completely factually untrue about history, about facts and figures. And this kind of thing has actually begun to influence the way people think. So, for example, I mean, you know that I am not a fan of the present government, right? So I understand that defeating the present government will no longer be enough to change the mindset that is inculcated in large sections of the Indian public, particularly in the northern Hindi-speaking part of India. And I have to say that unless we can do an equally effective job of corrective perspectives, that might be really something that could change the nature of our country and its public discourse for a long time to come.
I want to get a question here because you just spoke about social media. You, of course, have been very prolific on social media. You were the most followed politician for a while on Twitter before, I think,
till July 2013 when Mr. Modi overtook me.
Someone named Mr. Modi took over. So what do you think of your social media experience today? I mean, you are very interactive on it. But there were a couple of things that recently happened which brought this question to my mind. One was when you wished L.K. Advani good wishes on his birthday, and the other was the photograph with fellow women MPs, which you said was an attractive place to work, which created controversy, but you got a lot of backlash for that. Does social media exasperate you sometimes?
Not for those examples. Actually, the Advani thing, I must say, I thought was absurd.
Well, I gave those examples because you pushed back on those
as well.
So
on what Nidhi is referring to is I just issued birthday wishes to Mr. Advani, and a lot of people hit back in very harsh language saying this is the man who polarized the country, divided the nation, the whole Babri Masjid business, the tragedy that has enveloped the nation since then is all his fault. How can you wish him? To which my answer very simply was and remains that you can be courteous to an individual on a personal landmark while at the same time continuing to fight against everything he stands for politically, which I have done throughout. I mean, from the days of the Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, my views have been very clear and have been made apparent in writing, and therefore anyone can check what I've been saying on these issues. I've been consistent for 35 years on all these matters. So I didn't feel that I needed to explain to people that my wishing L.K. Advani is not because I'm suddenly itching to join the BJP or changing into a Hindutva icon. I'm just being courteous to a gentleman who's turned 95 or 94, whatever it was, and I felt it was a nice thing to do for somebody who's lasted that long. He's almost a grandfatherly figure in our politics, whether or not I disagree with him, and I do disagree with him. So that was the on that issue. But what is striking is I also did it because I felt self-confident that I would not be misunderstood, and I realized that self-confidence is misplaced in our social media because you're constantly having to prove yourself to a bunch of people who have no historical memory. So I have been writing for 40 years. This book, in fact, reflects many of my writings over a 40-year period. My first book was published in 1981. And yet, I am dealing daily with critics who only know by what my last tweet has said. And that, of course, is a particular challenge of the social media era. The second example Nidhi gave is one in which I was so secure myself in my own virtue that I ended up coming across as a villain. What happened was this. As some of you may or may not know, but I've often talked about this, I've grown up without any sort of hassles in my mind about being a feminist before the word was invented. I had a strong, very independent-minded mother. I have. She's now 86. I have two sisters I grew up with at home who are strong, independent-minded women. And I married strong, independent-minded women. So I never had any particular problem seeing women very much as fully rounded human beings with their own qualities unrelated to their gender. And because I've always behaved that way, and everyone who knows me knows I'm like that, and no one's ever seen me as a sexist, I thought almost jokingly that I could get away with what I did. What happened was one morning, Parliament was adjourned because of disruption, and as I came out into the, from the Lok Sabha chamber into the corridor outside, there were half a dozen women MPs chatting, and they said, "Oh, Shashi, come and join us," this and that. And then somebody said, "Let's take a selfie." And in fact, I'm hopeless at taking selfies, I should warn you. So one of the MPs said, "Oh, I'm very good at that, I'll do it." And she stuck her phone out in front, took a thing. And it so happened that the way we were all standing, there I was in the middle of a group of women MPs. And they all said, "Shashi, you have to tweet this." So I said, "Fine, I'll tweet it." And then I was thinking, what should I say? And I could have said something totally banal, like, with a group of MPs today at Parliament. I thought, that's so silly. Why don't I do something slightly mischievous and jokey that we can laugh about? Now, because I thought, it's me, and it's like, attacking Desmond Tutu for being a racist or something. I thought, who's going to attack me? I'll make a joke out of it. And boy, was I wrong, right? So every single sort of liberal-minded woman in the Twitter sphere went after me, and I had sort of 24 hours of being the villain of social media for having said, who says the Lok Sabha isn't an attractive place to work? Now, the funniest thing is that when all this hit the fan and there were articles in the newspapers the next day, every one of the 6 came to me and said, "We are with you. Thank you for saying this. We are not ashamed. We have no problem with this." So everyone took it in the right spirit, but people a little distance away, they didn't get the spirit of camaraderie and good humor in which I had done.
No, but can I ask you honestly, would you have tweeted a picture with a group of male MPs and said the same thing?
Yeah. Listen, suppose we'd had half a dozen muscular types, and there are some muscular MPs in Parliament.
Who says only muscular is attractive?
I would have said, who says the opposition isn't strong? Question mark. It was a pun. It was a joke. It's a question of what the quality is.
That's even worse, because you've just said that, if it's muscular men, strong, and if it's women, attractive. I'm saying use the word attractive with male MPs. Would you do that?
No, because I'm not gay, but if I were, I would.
Oh, God. That comment is going to get you into...
Okay, so I'm going to stick to my guns on this, Nidhi.
Okay, all right. I'm going to take a breather and get the students to ask the next one.
Sorry.
Okay, but 1 second. Yes, in the patterned shirt, and I'll come to that side as well, and this side.
You didn't say in the attractive shirt, right?
No.
Good afternoon, sir. So my question is that in one of your book, Why I'm a Hindu, you mentioned that Shiv Sena is a bigoted nature party. Okay. So in the year...
Shiv Sena is a?
Bigoted, like the one who only works on some
boycott.
thought process. Yeah.
Bigoted, okay.
Bigoted. So
a bigot, you call the Shiv Sena a bigoted party?
Yeah.
So in the year 2019, as Congress and Shiv Sena form alliance, so what do you think? Was that for political benefits and all? Or some other thing came in?
Was it an opportunistic alliance? I think that's...
Was it for political benefits, the alliance?
So the answer, quite frankly, is obviously, if I were involved in that process, I might have approached it differently. But those who have settled this situation have been able to point quite correctly to the fact that in power, the Shiv Sena has considerably de-emphasized that aspect of its convictions and has instead become very much a collegial member of an alliance which has been, in fact, the most effective resistance to the BJP in Maharashtra. So you could argue, however opportunistic it was at the time, or it was seen at the time as being, that it's turned out to be a successful experiment. And as a successful experiment, it has actually thwarted the ambitions of the BJP in Maharashtra, as well as providing pretty good governance. I mean, most people will say that the government of the three parties in Maharashtra has done a pretty decent job, including in handling COVID over the years. And this has been, therefore, the best advertisement for the fact. Obviously, if having come to power, they had taken a great deal of pains to emphasize that aspect of their agenda, the alliance would not have lasted. And that's one thing in political alliances, generally speaking. When UPA was formed in 2004, wisely, the first thing they agreed was a common minimum program. You can't have 20 parties with different manifestos and ideologies, all pursuing their own line. So there has to be a common line that a coalition pursues. And in that, the Congress doesn't buy the BJP, the Shiv Sena's agenda on, let's say, minorities, and the Shiv Sena may not buy the NCP's agenda on, say, madrasa education, whatever it may be. But at the bottom, on the essential government programs, governance policies, and so on, distribution of portfolios, how to manage certain issues, they've had common ground, and from there, they've built up a very effective administration.
All right, let's get more questions. Can you see any of the young ladies in the audience? Raise their hand. Come on, let's get more women to ask questions. Yes, okay, yes, please.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
My question is that we all know you as a man who's rich with words. So have you ever been at loss of words?
Lethologica, it's called.
Oh dear.
The sudden moment when there's a word you want to use, it's trembling at the tip of your tongue, but it doesn't come through. It happens to everybody. I'm sure it's happened to me too. I can't immediately point to a particular moment when it has, but it happens to all of us. It's a human affliction. I think the main thing is if you know enough words, and the very specific word you're trying to summon doesn't appear, you know other words that will try and convey the same idea, maybe not as well, but at least you can. The problem is if you only have a few words and you forget them, then you're in trouble.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Okay, okay.
There's
Yes.
a lady in the corner
Right
there.
at the corner, yeah. Just wait for the mic. Who has the mic? Yeah. Thank you. Run.
Good afternoon. I'm
Good
really
afternoon.
grateful to be able to interact with you. I'm Shreya from Geetham School of Technology. So here's my question. If you were given a chance to amend the Constitution, what would you change? Like without interference. It's a
Well,
hypothetical.
that's going to be a controversial answer because I have a minority view on this. I would change India into a presidential system. And by that, I don't mean just a president sitting in Delhi directing the country. I mean elected chief executives at all levels. I think we have chosen a system which I find flawed conceptually as well as in practice. Conceptually, because I've always been a believer in the separation of powers. Montesquieu's famous Spirit of the Laws, where he said that the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary should be completely independent of each other. That's, to me, makes the most sense if these are to work in tandem. Today, we have a situation where no one is elected to the legislature to legislate. They are elected in order to form the government because of the peculiar perversion of the British parliamentary system. And once the government is formed, they cease to matter. It's as simple as that. Today, the BJP can pass a law saying the moon is made of green cheese, and their tame legislators will vote for it. And if they refuse, by the way, under the anti-defection law, they can be expelled from parliament. So in that kind of situation, we have essentially lost the advantages of an independent legislature to which the executive should be accountable. That's why conceptually, I think the system is bad. In practice, we've seen that in almost no way is the system working as it should be, as it does in, say, in the UK, which is a small island country. There, each constituency is only about 1 lakh of people. The MP genuinely is in touch with the majority of his voters or her voters and represents their views effectively in Parliament. They have complete freedom to disagree with their party line. There is no sort of a compulsory whip on every single law. The way the British system works, the parliamentary system could work in that country. In India, it doesn't work that way. Every one of these elements doesn't happen. I represent 2 million people. I can essentially only pay attention to the squeakiest wheels, or the ones who come and see me and press their demands upon me. I'm also helpless in being able to do very much for them because I have no executive power as an MP. And if you look at other levels, take, for example, a city or a town or a village. In China, for example, which is not a democratic country, still the town mayor or the village chief has the authority to take all decisions and the accountability for the decisions that matter in governing that village or that town. In India, a mayor is a sort of glorified chair of an extremely weak council, a committee of people, none of whom have any power either. And the real power is exercised by an unelected bureaucrat called the municipal commissioner. That's the way in which our system works.
Is China the best example?
Beg your pardon?
Is China the best example?
No, I'm saying even in a non-democracy, there is somebody who is responsible and accountable. He may not be accountable to the public because the voters don't vote for him, but if he fails, his head is for the chopping block from above.
Is there a greater danger of authoritarianism if you have a presidential system?
So that's the other good question. There are two other good questions. One is that one. Is there a greater danger of authoritarianism? To which my answer is no, because in a country our size, every directly elected leader who gets irresponsibly dangerous ideas will be checkmated by another directly elected leader elsewhere. So if you have a directly elected head of a village panchayat, that person still would have to deal also with the directly elected head of the Zilla Parishad, who would have to deal with the directly elected head of the state, the governor of the state.
What about the
and
directly elected
Prime
Prime
Minister?
Minister? What about the directly elected Prime
The
Minister?
Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister in turn can be stymied by a directly elected state chief minister if he does something the state chief minister doesn't want. You see what I'm saying? And there is no automatic majority for him to get whatever he wants done through Parliament. Right now, whatever Mr. Modi wants is a rubber stamp in Parliament. In an independent legislature, he has to negotiate his way for every law he wants to pass.
Like the US?
That's the second question. What about the US as a bad example of gridlock? To which the answer is, gridlock in the American system is because there are only two parties. So if one party occupies the White House, another party controls one of the houses, there'll be gridlock between the two of them. In India, we have 45 parties in Parliament even today. So as long as the directly elected Prime Minister or President has the creative energy to actually work out different coalitions on different issues. So work with, say, both the BJP and the Congress on the women's reservation bill, knowing that, say, the Samajwadi will not support. But tomorrow work with Samajwadi and RJD on an OBC issue. All of those different kinds of alliances are possible when you have totally independent bodies with their own authority and accountability. And so similarly, when it comes to actually implementing things, imagine if you have a town and the mayor has both the authority and the budget to be responsible for every pothole in the road, for the electricity in his town, for the sewage not working, all of that stuff. The voters actually have civic responsibility enshrined in the system itself, and they can hold the person accountable if he or she fails to deliver. We can't do that today.
You have written about this actually extensively. What is the reaction you get from colleagues?
All my political colleagues shy away from this immediately, and I don't blame them. Everyone likes to work the system that they know. And no one is prepared to contemplate a different idea, which is why that question, I'm afraid, led me to an answer that is purely academic, because no one is actually going to do what I suggested.
All right, let me get, yes.
There's some on that side also.
Yeah, I'll come this way. I promise I'll come this way after that. In the white T-shirt with the green, yes. I'm not going to make the he-she mistake again.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mitali. I'm from Geetham School of Science. So my question is, actually, you're a famous author and a political leader. I just want to know how the life of an author is different from life of a political leader.
They're actually totally incompatible, my dear. The author has to really find space within his or her own mind and the time to shut off the rest of the world and just focus on what he or she is writing. Whereas the politician has to be constantly available to the rest of the world. So that's why I was telling Nidhi I often don't really get to write till after 11 o'clock, because Otherwise, I could be writing something that matters to me, and the phone call comes from the constituency, or an MP lands up, or even just a regular person seeks an appointment to come and do something. I will have to give them attention because that's my job. And that's essentially the difficulty in doing both, and I'm very acutely conscious of. I've tried to resolve it. I didn't fully answer Nithi's question because I've tried to resolve that for myself by giving up my attempts to write fiction. My last novel was published in 2001, which is now 20 years ago, because fiction really requires that space inside your head to create an alternative universe that is as real to you. You know, characters, episodes, dialogue, situations, as real to you as what you're encountering in your daily life. Because you're really building up this illusory sort of palace of glass. And to be able to sustain it and inhabit it day after day is an impossible task for somebody in politics, because I might be conceiving of this world, entering into it, and suddenly be interrupted. Suddenly have an election campaign to campaign for, suddenly have something else to do, a trip to make, a conference to attend, Nithi insisting I come to Hyderabad. What do? The result, therefore, is that that glass palace develops cracks. And after 4 or 5 cracks, it just shatters altogether. And then you can't enter that palace again. You can't go into that illusory world because it's no longer real. That becomes the problem. So the first few years of this century, my laptop became littered with half-begun manuscripts of novels. Until I finally realized, forget this, stick to non-fiction, because non-fiction is interruptible. Let's say I'm writing something. I've got to interrupt it to make this trip and so on. I won't get back to that thing for 3 days, or for that matter, even 2 weeks. I know that I can reread what I've written, and my mind will immediately click into the flow of the argument I was trying to make. And then I can pick it up and continue writing and do it. So non-fiction has been my form of writing. Not necessarily the ideal way I write. I might sometimes, if I was not a politician, and I've done this before, in my earlier days at the UN, before I became too senior to have the luxury of doing this, I would sometimes literally wake up on a Saturday morning when my family was away on holiday in India and I was in New York. I would wake up on a Sunday morning and write from 8 a.m. to midnight, having meals even at my desk, and churn out sort of 25 pages of publishable text in the process. That kind of writing, which for me was essential because I couldn't do it Monday to Friday, that kind of writing is no longer possible in this kind of job. So that's the main difference.
Let's come this side. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, the young lady there.
Hi, sir. I'm Pavitra from School of Technology. So,
A little higher, hold the mic a little higher.
Put the mic up here.
Yeah.
So, according to you, what exactly India is lagging? Because we are still striving our country to be a developed country rather than being a developing country.
Could you repeat the question?
So, according to you, what exactly India is lagging to be a developed country?
Okay.
What are we lacking?
Yeah. Why are we still a developing country?
We have an awful lot to do, and that's partially because, and I'm not saying this to apportion blame, but just a historical fact, partially because we started in a very bad place. The British left us a total wreck in 1947. They had drained all the resources that could have gone to building up India. They had drained it. There's now a new study by a scholar in England that says $45 trillion is the value of what they drained out of India during their 200 years of loot and pillage and plunder. And that's something we mustn't forget. So we had been, when they came, the second richest country in the world in terms of contribution to global GDP. We ended up, by the time they left, as one of the poorest. We had 90% of our population living below the poverty line. We had a life expectancy of just 27 and a literacy rate of 16%. Now, when you look at all of that, we've actually made a phenomenal amount of progress. But given where we started, we're nowhere yet ready to call ourselves a developed country. There are parts of India which are living in the developed world. And an institution like this seems to me, you won't find anything better than this in a developed country either. So there are parts of India which are developed to world standards, right? But there are also parts of India which, frankly, are still living in what others abroad would consider to be really many, many centuries in the past. And that kind of reality has to be overcome. We need to use sort of contemporary terminology, we need to still do a lot on the hardware of our development, the ports, the airports, the railways, the highways, the infrastructure, and also on the software of our development, which are the intangible things that are so essential. Sanitation, healthcare. About 250 million of our people don't have a clinic within a 5-kilometer walk of their places of residence. If they have any illness, literally they need to go beyond 5 kilometers to find something. Education. Education is fundamentally essential. Right now, I think we have 26 or 27% of our students of college-going age who are in college. And the government talks about getting it to 50%. But they're a long way from there. And similarly, when it comes to education at lower levels, we would like to think that with the Right to Education Act and so on, we managed to catch all the illiterate kids in our net. First of all, I'm not sure that's 100% true. Just by going to a construction site, you'll see a lot of kids still scrabbling in the dust and dirt. But there's also, frankly, the fact that there are people who got left out earlier, who are adults now and are still illiterate. And so the education has become a big area where we're lacking in. So all of these things, ultimately, we cannot truly call ourselves a developed country until we can say that every Indian can take for granted sort of 3 square meals a day, a roof over their head, the chance of sending their kids to a decent school, the prospect of a meaningful and remunerative job or employment, and always the dream, the hope of a better life. If you have that, then you're living in a developed country. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, if you don't know if your kids can go to school, if you don't know whether you can survive the next illness, if you don't know that you can't hope for anything better tomorrow, that means you're still in a state of struggle and overcoming fundamental social and political disabilities.
Well, last question, and that's from me actually, before we wrap up. If you had to crystal gaze and give us a very honest assessment of 2024, do you think the opposition is going to be in a position to put up a serious challenge to the BJP in 2024? And I ask this in the context of a lot of uncertainty within your own party and its leadership, and bickering now that's very open between various opposition parties, particularly yours and the Trinamool Congress. Is it going to be a serious challenge to Modi?
I certainly hope so, and I'm working for it to be so. But I think there's no grounds for complacency for the reasons you mentioned, but also because even last 2 times when Mr. Modi won, he won with 31% and 37%. But what went wrong was that the remaining 63 and 69 were scattered amongst a large number of parties. And as a result, the opposition was unable to offer a coherent alternative picture. Now, today it seems to me, therefore, that opposition unity is absolutely essential. We've got 2.5 years to go. That gives us enough time to create a platform on which the parties of the opposition can come together, find common ground. You can't snap your fingers and create alliances. One has got to get into the habit of meeting and sharing space and moving forward. But I do believe that that would be very much the way forward. If you're looking at 2024 objectively, you also have to take into account the very many negatives around the BJP. There's been a collapse of economic growth, as we've never seen before. There's been the highest unemployment ever recorded. Ever since they began recording unemployment, it's never been as bad as this. There's been, sadly, a tragic mismanagement of COVID, including so many people dying for preventable things like lack of hospital beds, lack of oxygen, and then, of course, at the end, people couldn't even afford to cremate their loved ones and were floating them into the Ganga across northern India, across UP at any rate. So looking at all of this, there's plenty of failures, and then, of course, the farmers' agitation also showed the government at its most, shall we say, arrogant, passing laws without serious discussion with the stakeholders concerned, and then indeed taking them back without further discussion with the stakeholders.
Optimistic that the
So
opposition
I'm saying,
unity
you've
will
got
happen.
all of these negatives, and you have a united opposition that's able to point to these negatives, as well as offer a coherent alternative. Because, I mean, certainly speaking from As a Congress MP, I can say we have a track record we can point to. We can say, look at all the things we did for you when we were in power. We'll be coming back in the same space as a party that delivered Manrega, the party that delivered welfare programs, the party that delivered the first of what's now been rebaptized the Jan Dhan accounts. That started under Manmohan Singh.
Mamta so angry with you?
Beg your pardon?
Why is Mamta Banerjee so angry with the Congress?
No, I think I can understand her feelings because, of course, when she was running in her own state, the Congress chose, in my view, unwisely, not to support her. And indeed, she probably feels that if they can do this to me, I can do this to them. I think we need to get over this. We need to get over this, misunderstanding and get everyone together and say, listen, ultimately we have far more in common. Mamta Banerjee spent much of her life in Congress, and her political beliefs are literally not distinguishable from those of the Congress party.
Well, yeah, that's very, very candid of you. Very candid of you. Please give a big round of applause to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. It has been fascinating to listen to you. I mean, obviously, I couldn't help but ask the political question at the end, but to just listen to your life's journey, your childhood, where your accent came from, that was interesting. All those things. It was nice to get to know a different side of you, Shashi Tharoor. Thank you so much for joining us here on campus today.
Thank you, Nidhi, and thank you all for being such a good audience.